Hi, everyone. Nice to see some familiar, but also a lot of new faces this afternoon. My name is Erin Nelson, and I am faculty in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Guelph. And my research, broadly speaking, focuses on the development of sustainable food systems. I've looked at it from a lot of different angles, looked at food security and more of the consumption end of things, but mostly have focused on production and specifically ecological, agroecological, different aspects of sustainable food production, mostly in Latin America, but more recently I've been working in Ontario as well.
Thanks so much, Erin. Tongzhe?
Yeah, thanks, Paige. Good to see everyone. My name is Tongzhe Li. I'm an associate professor with the Food, Agriculture, and Resource Economics Department here at the University of Guelph. I am an experimental economist, and for those of you who might not be familiar with that terminology, I will be able to introduce that to you a little later this afternoon. Really excited. And what I will talk about and what's really most exciting to me in terms of research these days is how to use experiments to see what we can do, how we can do it in order to make people adopt innovation, exciting innovations in agriculture. Looking forward to it.
Thank you both. So as you notice, we will be recording the presentation portion of this afternoon's sessions. And then when we move into discussion, we will stop the recording just so that there's no pressure on anybody. With that being said, I will pass the floor over to Erin.
Thanks, Paige. I'm just going to get my screen sharing. Okay, so thank you, everybody, and thanks for the invitation to be here this afternoon. I'm going to be talking about this project that I have on the go, which is called the Social Networks for Healthy Soils project, so appropriate for given the title of the webinar. And this project is looking at evaluating the Ontario Soil Network and its leadership challenge, amongst other things. And I'd just like to give an acknowledgement to Jenna Livingston, who's been a key part of the data analysis for this presentation. She's not able to be here today, but also to Paige and a whole bunch of other people who over the last couple of years have been part of the team that has pulled this project together. So what I'm going to talk about today is just give a really brief overview of what this project is all about. I'll talk about the research methods. The project involved collaboration with 3 different organizations. We've got the findings pulled together for one organization, so I'll briefly talk about that. And then I'll go much more in depth with respect to the findings with the Ontario Soil Network. And then hopefully we'll have lots of time for discussion at the end. But as Paige said, happy to have questions throughout the presentation as well. So the Social Networks for Healthy Soils project is a collaboration with the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario, the Ontario Soil Network, and the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association. And it really got started when I was having conversations with representatives from those 3 different organizations that started off very general, like what were their research interests? What questions did they have? And through the course of a number of conversations, we pulled together this project and were able to secure funding together through the Ontario Agri-Food Innovation Alliance, which is a partnership between OMAFRA and the University of Guelph. And the overall goals of this 3-year project, which is now extended into a 4th year, were to understand how and why network-based peer-to-peer learning programs contribute to soil health best management practice adoption. So we understand that these kind of network-based farmer-to-farmer programs do tend to contribute to adoption, but we wanted to really get a better understanding of how and why that's the case. And we also really wanted to look at how these programs could be improved upon, supported, and expanded in the context of Ontario. So the methods that we are employing for this project, the first piece is that we're doing these participatory evaluations of 3 specific peer learning programs. And I've highlighted that in bold because that specific piece of the project is going to be what I'm focusing the presentation on today. Those evaluations, it's important to say that they were participatory because it involved really close collaboration with each of the organizations in figuring out what we wanted to do for the evaluation. We developed logic models with each of the organizations. I'll speak a bit more about that. And then we also ended up carrying out an online survey with organizational members, a series of in-depth interviews, and in one case, also a follow-up focus group. And then other components of the project are we have a best practice review underway in terms of peer learning programs, and that involved a whole series of key informant interviews, as well as a literature review. And we've got a fantastic research assistant who's working on that component of the project right now. And we also are hoping to conduct research, or will be planning to conduct research with farmers who are less inclined to prioritize soil health best management practices, or have just been a little bit more reluctant for various reasons. And I can see Heather looks like is on the webinar today, and she is going to be moving that piece of the project forward in the coming months. So evaluating these peer learning programs, the 3 specific programs that we're looking at were the EFAO's Farmer-Led Research Program, OSCIA's Tier 2 on-farm research projects, and then the Ontario Soil Network, and specifically its Leadership Challenge. So those were our 3 kind of case study programs that we were doing these in-depth evaluations of. And in terms of what we did, the first step in the process was a collaborative planning process, which involved a whole series of meetings that took place over a few months, some with each individual organization and its representatives. And then we had a few collaborative meetings as well, or collective meetings with representatives of the 3 organizations to develop these logic models. And for people who may not know what a logic model is, I'll show you an example in a second. But it's essentially a program evaluation tool that helps link up an organization's goals, its activities, and then the anticipated short, medium, and long-term outcomes that are associated with those activities. So it's kind of about painting a picture that shows with some sort of logical flow how an organization or a program hopes to get from where we are to where they want to be through the activities that it's carrying out. So through this planning process, we came up with a set of shared program goals, and they differed to some extent across the 3 programs, but there were quite a few commonalities. And some of those commonalities were that there was a real emphasis on growing and also shifting the social networks that farmers belong to and engage with, improving farmers' knowledge of best management practices, increasing their confidence and also their motivation to use those practices, enhancing their capacity and also opportunity to use particular practices. And then, of course, the end goal is increasing adoption. And here you can see the example of the logic model we came up with specifically for the Ontario Soil Network. And there's a lot of text on this page, and it doesn't really, the point isn't to look at all of the detail here, but just to sort of see the exercise we went through, which was really to say, okay, what are the activities associated with, for example, in the middle row, you see the Leadership Challenge. In the short term, what outcomes are we hoping to get from those activities? Improved leadership skills, for example, perhaps improved confidence or knowledge. In the medium term, what are some of the spin-off impacts from those more immediate things? And that might be things like we've got more outreach, more mentorship happening of farmers around Ontario. And then beyond that, what's the longer term outcome that we're hoping to get at? So those different sets of outcomes, which, like I said, we seem to have a, sorry, I wasn't sure if that was something in the chat or not. This kind of plan helped us figure out what questions we were going to ask when we were actually evaluating the program. So the next step of this evaluation process, which flowed from the development of these logic models, was that we developed an online survey to get at some of those questions about the extent to which some of those outcomes and impacts were being seen. So we surveyed members of the 3 organizations. We asked them about their use of different best management practices. We also specifically asked them about some of the impacts of their membership in these organizations and the specific target programs that we were evaluating. We got 292 total responses to that survey, which we were quite happy with that response rate. 139 EFAO members, 122 OSCIA members, and then we had 49 affiliates of the Ontario Soil Network respond to the survey. Some of you on this call maybe responded to that survey. The next step in the evaluation was we wanted to collect some more in-depth qualitative research. So I'm a mixed methods researcher, but most of my research tends to be qualitative. My expertise primarily is in gathering stories and sort of rich, in-depth qualitative data, because I think in my experience, that's really helpful when we're trying to get a sense of those how and why questions, which are at the heart of this research project. So how are these networks working? Why are they working? Why are they maybe not working in ways that they want to? So we did follow-up interviews from the survey with 17 EFAO members. We also did a focus group with farmer-led researchers from the EFAO. We did 10 interviews with the Ontario Soil Network and 5 with OSCIA. So a really quick and dirty overview of the research results from the work with EFAO and their farmer-led research program. This is just a snapshot of the evaluation results. The full evaluation report is available on the EFAO's website, and I've put the hyperlink there for people who are interested in checking this out. The survey showed us that the most commonly used management practices by EFAO members were soil cover cropping over winter, compost application, and cover cropping. A majority, more than 75% of the respondents felt that the EFAO was helping them improve their knowledge and also increase their adoption of specific BMPs. Interestingly, we found that people who were participating as farmer researchers were far more likely than other EFAO members to report that the EFAO had a positive impact on their relationship with BMPs. The big barriers that we found to adoption were lack of time and labor, high cost, and insufficient knowledge. And just sort of an interesting thing that came out of the survey was that almost a full third of respondents were planning in the near future to initiate no-till farming, which was actually less common amongst EFAO farmers than it was amongst soil network farmers. And then when we looked at the impact specifically of the farmer-led research program, we could kind of thematically pull them out into 5 different categories. We found that the program was really enhancing the quality and the reliability of on-farm data collection. That then was really important for enabling farmers to make evidence-based decisions on their farms. So they were getting this evidence from peer farmers and applying it on their own farms. The program really instilled a strong sense of pride in the people who were participating. That was perhaps in some ways one of the more unexpected outcomes, but was really prevalent when we talked to participants. It fostered a feeling of community amongst knowledge generators and also users of knowledge, and across the broader network. So that sense of community, again, was this sort of intangible, in some ways, impact, but really important, and ties into some of the results I'll talk about later with respect to the soil network. And then another interesting result was that we found that the program really enables effective communication about the benefits of ecological farming practices to a wide range of audiences. So a lot of participants talked about how the knowledge they generated or learned about through farmer-led research served as a really good communication platform for them to speak with a wide variety of farmers, including some of their maybe more conventional neighbors. And again, that kind of circles back to that idea of having really strong evidence. So that is that program in a nutshell. And now I'll get into the results of the research with the soil network. So the participant profile, briefly, we had 49 soil network affiliates who filled out the survey. The vast majority had participated in the leadership challenge, but there was a significant chunk that hadn't, but they'd attended field days or other presentations and events. A few had just read about program results, and then there were a few other participants who had been involved in the network in like an organizational capacity, for example. Excuse me. In terms of farming experience, the soil network participants were actually much more experienced than many of the EFAO participants. The majority had been farming for 20 plus years. Types of production, the most common type of production was field crops. Again, a bit of a difference from the EFAO participants who were first and foremost fruit and vegetable producers. And then a quick rundown of the survey findings. So we asked people what soil BMPs they were already using. And this shows percentage of respondents. So you can see the top two, which were used by like almost all of the respondents, were cover crops and crop rotations of 3 or more crops. And then you can see, sort of going down the line, the less commonly used BMPs were things like compost use, rotational grazing. Makes sense if you think about the type of farming. We didn't have a lot of livestock farmer representation. So then we asked people about the impacts of the soil network on their relationship with best management practices. And we had a number of categories that we were interested in assessing. And you can see we found that the participants tended to say that the organization had a positive impact on their relationship with best management practices. The top most widely agreed upon impact for soil network members was that it allowed people to support other farmers in adopting best management practices. So that's sort of an interesting thing that people saw. It just beat out by a narrow margin as the top impact, but I think it's interesting that that idea of supporting others was really key in membership with the soil network. Also increased confidence and motivation. And we know that confidence and motivation are so key in actually getting to that adoption of a practice. We also see high agreement with the idea that the soil network helped people improve upon existing practices. And interestingly, it actually helped people improve their practices more than it necessarily helped them adopt new practices. What it wasn't really helping people do, if you look down to the bottom of that chart, was access the resources required to adopt BMPs. And we can get into that in a minute. In terms of the impacts on farmer social networks, we saw also quite strong positive impact. Again, this is by percentage of respondents, but about 3/4 of the respondents saying that the soil network helped improve their connection with farmers across Ontario, and also with the broader farming sector. A little bit less, but still about 2/3 saying it improved their connection with farmers in their area. I was a bit interested that less people said it improved their connection with farmer mentors and advisors, but still a majority of people seeing that connection. And then some people actually saying that participating in the network improved their connection with their customers, which was interesting. And the final survey finding I just want to highlight was when we asked people about barriers to adoption. Similar to the EFAO results, we saw the top barrier being a lack of materials, closely followed by the cost, time, and labor, and then risk of yield loss, lack of knowledge. There's a fair amount of talk about this idea of what neighbors might think, but it was interesting that that didn't show up very much at all amongst participants. Okay, so to finish up, I'm going to talk a little bit about the qualitative data, and I'm going to preface this by saying that qualitative data analysis in some respects takes a lot more time than quantitative data analysis. It was fairly easy. It took us a long time to put together the survey and collect that data, but once we had it, you can put it into an Excel spreadsheet and get a nice graph fairly quickly. The qualitative data analysis is still underway, so I would suggest that these themes are still somewhat preliminary. But a few things that really jumped out as being common across a majority or a significant percentage of those 10 qualitative data participants was this idea of a really strong interrelationship between cost savings and environmental benefit. So a lot of people actually talked about long-term cost savings being a primary motivator for getting involved with a particular soil health BMP, but then seeing the environmental benefit or benefit in terms of soil health, and then the sort of positive feedback loop between those two factors. So I've got this quote from one farmer who said, "We started no-till on the farm to reduce labor and equipment costs, but you don't get to the erosion, so we started cover cropping. We were seeing more extreme weather events and getting some erosion in our fields. Having the cover crops help protect against erosion, and then we started seeing more health benefits in the soil." So you saw a lot of participants talking sort of in the same breath about cost and soil health together. And I think we tend to think of them as somewhat separate, or they tend to be talked about by researchers at least as separate, but the farmers really talked about them as one thing. Another big theme that came out was this idea of networks, relationships, and trust. And those ideas are all sort of tightly woven together, and link back to that impact I talked about with the work with the EFAO in terms of community building. And we've got this one farmer saying peers listen to peers because they're on the same level. Sometimes with government organizations, it's like a top-down sort of approach, and that doesn't work as well. Farmers trust other farmers. It's so effective. So this idea of farmers talking to other farmers, seeing other farmers as a really trusted source of information about soil health, and that trust mitigating some of the risk associated with potentially adopting a new practice or new innovation. And then another farmer added, one of the biggest impacts is helping to develop those relationships that are important support for farmers so that they don't feel alone, that they're getting that support from other farmers who do what they do. So this idea again, that feeling of being part of a community also in some ways mitigates some of the risk associated with adopting a new practice. In some ways, the flip side of that, we had quite a number of farmers talk about some of how other types of relationships created some challenges. So this one farmer said, it's an ongoing discussion with my brother. He loves to till. I want to stop tilling. So there's a bit of tension there. And we saw that idea of sort of family tension play out amongst a few different participants. one other qualitative data theme, this idea of confidence, was extremely prevalent. A lot of farmers talking about how membership in the soil network made them feel more confident in what they were doing. I'm more confident now. The guys are saying we're different in the fields. So they're buying in. So this idea that the more confident someone becomes, the more of an influencer they can be, because they're really sort of holding their ground, and people then look to someone who's confident for advice. So in this case, it was a family, and people were saying, hey, mom, what should we do here? Because they saw that confidence. So to wrap up the next steps in the research, like I said, we still have more work to do with this qualitative data. So we're going to do that, complete the summary report for the Ontario Soil Network. We then have to finish up the data analysis and reporting for OSCIA. And like I said, we have a research assistant right now working on completing the lit review and analyzing the key informant data to get that best practice review. And we've got the research with the more reluctant farmers who are finding it's harder to prioritize BMP adoption. That is it. Very happy to take some questions.
Don't mind me, I just pulled us out into gallery mode.
Yeah, no, thank you.
See all of our lovely faces.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'd love to kind of tie this into our morning learning, just kind of, and tie the validation that seeing lots of your peers doing something imparts on an idea. I'd like to tie that into this idea of trust, and kind of what aspects of like peer-to-peer communication are kind of the special ingredient that allows for that message to bear a bit more weight. Yeah, like what are we seeing there when we're seeing just like that inherent trust?
So one piece of that came out from the data across the different organizations was the idea that the people you're getting information from, if they're a peer, they're taking the same risks that you are. So like if I give advice to a farmer, but I have a job at the university and it doesn't really matter to me, like it's not going to have an impact on my livelihood if somebody faces a yield loss, the advice feels different, right? But if it's someone who's experiencing the same risks, and also someone who is from the same context as well. So there was a lot of talk about the contextual nature of some of this peer-to-peer work, how important it was to have somebody who has an understanding of your specific maybe climate conditions or farming type to be imparting the advice. So that, you know, it's not just can't just be any farmer necessarily, but a farmer who understands the context within which you're working.
Yeah, certainly. One of my favorite stories that like kind of ties that theme into an experience is talking with a dairy farmer about like how it was that he decided to finally go no-till, because he had this hang up for the longest time. It was like, what do I do with my manure? And it wasn't until he talked to another dairy farmer that dairy farmer was able to make all of the same heuristic leaps that this farmer in question was making, and be like, you spread manure on your hay fields, so you can do it because you don't till hay. Anyways, yeah, that trust is yeah, you have to share experience sometimes to have trust. But a great question from the comments, if not a peer-to-peer approach, are there any successful approaches for motivating those growers that are more reluctant to adopt new BMPs? And you've been all over the globe. So what else have you seen that has kind of like harnessed these themes?
It's interesting. This is the first thing that came to mind was we're hoping to get more at that question with the research that Heather's going to be doing that's really with some of those farmers. So we might have a better answer to your question later. A second comment I'd make about this Ontario-based work is that one of the things, again, that came out of the work on the farmer-led research was how much of a conversation starter it was across some of those divides. Like, people talked a lot about speaking with farmers who maybe fell into that more reluctant category about some of the research. And they found that that was actually really useful. The last thing I'd say, because Tori, you mentioned this idea of me working in other contexts, and I think this doesn't maybe resonate in an Ontario context, but one thing I've seen that's been very successful is policy. So I think there's maybe sometimes more room for policy pushes. And a lot of my work has been in Cuba, where the policy can be quite heavy-handed in terms of pushing farmers towards specific practices. I don't see that working in the Ontario context, but perhaps there is still more space for the government to think about different ways of incentivizing practices.
Yeah, which I think we're gonna get to dive into with a lot of Tongzhe's work there. Ooh, Luke has raised his hand. Ask your question, Luke.
Hi there. Thanks for the presentation, Erin. That was some really fascinating insights from your research. My question is, do you know of any way of monitoring the implementation of soil health practices? So say that, you have these findings. Do you have any indications from other research or information from the federal government about the adoption of no-till practices in the areas that you're conducting your research in?
Yeah, so that's not something that we're specifically tracking with our project. One of the things we hope to do through creating these evaluation strategies with these organizations was set up a strategy. Like, we collected all this data as part of an evaluation at a particular point in time. But the idea with creating the logic model is that that can serve for future evaluations as well. So, we went out and asked people, what practices are you using? Got a sense amongst survey respondents of how many people are using these practices. But ideally, that's the kind of research that could be conducted 5 years down the road. For example, it was interesting to me how many people said they weren't yet employing no-till, but they're planning on it in the future. So it might, yeah. But this project didn't have the scope to do a broader survey, like at the landscape scale.
Yeah, right. Well, that's one thing that I find interesting is that, for a lot of these soil health practices, it's like we're still kind of blind. Well, we're not quite sure how broadly they're being implemented, right? So yes, these studies like you're doing, these are extremely insightful. And like you say, they have policy, they can be leveraged for making policy changes. They can be leveraged for, Ontario Soil Network's approach to promoting these practices. But as far as like, okay, how are these practices being implemented across a landscape, at what rates? And I think those are some questions that, it's something that we're going to have to wrestle with eventually. But like you say, studies like yours, those questions are beyond the scope of a study like you've done.
I just really quickly see your question, Paul, and appreciate that. And yes, the answer is the reason I shared the quotes I did or the themes I did was because they resonated across a number of the participants. So those were themes that came up a fair amount. And there were a number of stories about that kind of intergenerational or sometimes even like interfamilial within the same generation tensions. And similarly, with respect to confidence, a lot of stories about how being part of a network like this, that, as Tori says, allowed people to not feel like a lunatic, really contributed to their confidence. So yes, there are other stories.
Well, I think those might be all of the questions from the chat. Yeah, those are all the questions from the chat. Moving forward. I don't want to steal the limelight away from Paige.
That's okay. I just saw another question come in from Chris. Did you want to ask your question directly, Chris?
It was more of just a straw poll that kind of happened at an OSCIA AGM recently, where 40 folks are asked if they cover cropped and 2 put their hands up. So it just gives you a kind of sense of, although it's not maybe it's not statistically a qualification of the adoption rate, but that was kind of what I noticed at that event.
Yeah, I mean, the federal government has like started to pull stats on BMP adoption, and we did just like finish or we not finished. We're in this lovely like state of limbo with the federal government of like constant revisions of the final report. But we validated a model of adoption called the ADOPT model, put together by David Pannell in Australia. That yeah, basically we are sitting at like anywhere between 10 and 15% cover crop adoption in Ontario. And like 15% is apparently the best that we can ever hope for, which is like a funny counterintuitive thing to me, because 15% is like the tipping point when you think of innovation diffusion. So it's better than 2 out of 40. Sometimes those groups can just be guarded around each other.
Yeah, that's a good point. I wanted to circle back quickly about your comment on policy and maybe room to grow that a little bit. When I think of policy, my brain kind of jumps immediately to financial incentives. And so I'm curious, since we're talking so much about the benefit of that like network to network and peer community-based incentivization, do you see how that can be incorporated into kind of a policy structure? Or maybe you've come across it in your work in different countries?
Well, we actually came up with a set of fairly specific policy recommendations as part of that EFAO report. And I would anticipate we would do the same with the soil network report, as we finish up with the analysis. And one of the policy there were a few policy recommendations from that EFAO report. And one of them was around funding these networks and supporting the creation of a network of networks. Because there's this, I saw Tori's face when I said that, because there's this sense that these networks are, people are part of all, like if you read about networks, people are part of all kinds of networks. Networks aren't inherently good, or they're not inherently inclined to push people towards best management practices, because you could be part of a network that is very inward looking and maybe keeps you in your traditional ways, as some of those quotes talked about. Oh, sorry, I see. Yeah, I will certainly put that link in the chat once I wrap up, which I think is momentarily. But yeah, we would like to see more support for these kinds of peer learning programs, because there isn't really a lot of funding for them right now, and there certainly isn't support for sort of taking advantage of some of the synergies that are out there. One of the things we saw was that there's some similar things maybe happening amongst different organizations, and how can we make sure that without duplicating work, that we're creating space for those synergies. So that's where that idea of a network of networks comes into play. And yeah, I mean, I think really I don't want to say it's all about money, but certainly there is space for more financing for this kind of work. I mean, it tends to be happening off the sides of people's desks. And when we ask people about like limitations, I didn't get into limitations today. That was a part of the research, and it's included in the EFAO report and will be included in the OSN report as well. But for all of these organizations, we find that like organizational structure can be really tough when funding is insecure and unstable. It's year to year. Sometimes staff isn't funded, farmer time isn't funded. So a lot of this work is voluntary. So that's sort of in some ways low-hanging fruit in terms of policy, but there's lots of other opportunities as well. Yeah, I could go into the whole topic of extension services, which has come up a lot in the research as well, publicly funded extension service and the lack thereof when it comes particularly to ecological farming practices or soil health BMPs. Yeah,
that's fantastic. Thank you. Suffice it to say, I think I need to go now and read your report more thoroughly. So thank you very much, Erin. That was fantastic and some great discussion. So next, I'd like to move the floor over to Tongzhe to share your presentation and your work with us.
Thank you. Let me see if I can share my screen. Did that work? Okay, great. So by sharing the screen, I actually can't see anybody's faces anymore, which hopefully is okay. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me here, and thanks for attending. So what I want to talk about for today is experimental economics for BMP adoption. And let's see. All right. So my talk has actually two broad parts. One part that goes first is to explain why we are using experiments to do this kind of work in terms of innovation adoption or BMP adoption. And then I am going to go into a new study that we just conducted at the Canada Outdoor Farm Show last year to give you a sense what we did, how we did it, and what did we find. So first of all, for those of you who are not very familiar with experimental economics, I thought I would spend some time to introduce it a little bit and answer the question of why. So the experimental approach has actually been a cornerstone of the scientific method for centuries. There are a lot of famous examples that are not for social sciences, but rather more generally in the medical field, so on and so forth. So famous examples would be vitamin C and scurvy. So basically, centuries ago, we established a causal relationship between the intake of vitamin C and the cure of scurvy, and that saved numerous lives. Another application would be the Learning Tower of Pisa, which really actually corrected our false belief where heavier objects would travel faster when they have a free fall compared to lighter objects. So then, how do we actually borrow that concept of the experiments and apply that to our social science, and in this case, BMP adoption? Right. So in this specific context and field, experiments actually compare outcomes in a treatment control setting Given all else equal, it can quantify causal influences of the tested treatments. And I highlighted two keywords here. One is outcomes, which means we're not really measuring people's opinions or their intentions, but rather we're measuring their behavioral outcomes in a quantitative way. And then the second keyword that I highlighted here is causal influences, meaning that through those kind of randomization of treatment control, we can clearly establish what actionable treatment can lead to what kind of behavioral outcomes, which I am going to give you an example in a minute. Okay, and economic experiments are a really versatile tool that can be innovatively used to test things that are not testable otherwise. To give you one example, okay, this was a novel economic experiments, and the title was called Nudging Farmers to Use Fertilizers, Theory and Experimental Evidence from Kenya. What the researchers actually found was farmers in West Kenya failed to take advantage of apparently profitable fertilizer investments. But they do invest in response to a small time-limited discounts on the cost of acquiring fertilizer when the researchers provided free shipping just after harvest. And the researchers further did some calibration, and they actually concluded that this policy, which you give them a small subsidy at the time of their harvest, rather than at the time when they actually apply the fertilizer in the next season, okay, this policy can yield higher welfare than either laissez-faire policies or heavy subsidies. So I thought that was really interesting. And then let me then step back. Okay, so in this case, the measurable outcome by the researchers were actually fertilizer adoption rate, and the treatment that they measured was a variety of subsidies. So then, in a general sense, okay, what are the examples of other measurable outcomes or measurement variables we can use in this type of research? One example is adoption rates. Okay, so for example, I'm working with the EFAO through a really large-scale reverse auction, and the outcome that we actually measured was through those kind of bidding and subsidy mechanisms. What are going to be the adoption rate of small grains in a region? Okay, another example would be productivity enhancement or environmental and ecosystem services, okay, that are also measurable. We can also measure market activities, such as, you know, who went on to purchase some practices at what price, so on and so forth. Okay. Then, so those are the measurable outcomes. What about the measurable inputs? So what can we do in terms of behavioral nudges? What can we do in terms of actionable treatments, such as policies? Okay. The examples that are examined a lot in the current literature would be, for example, information. So the disclosure of information, the framing of information, as well as the messengers have found to be somewhat important when people make decisions in terms of BMP adoption. Labels would be another one, priming, such as social norms and price anchoring, as well as other policy instruments, such as education mandates, tax and subsidies. Okay. So before I jump right into what we did about 3 months ago, I also wanted to give you an overview of my previous work. So basically, what were I able to do in this field? Well, so you can read a lot of information from the titles of all of those publications. And what's really picking a lot of people's attention among the three, for example, is the second one. As you can read from the title, a story induces greater environmental contributions than scientific information among liberals, but not conservatives. And the paper was just published last year. And actually, the reason why I wanted to highlight this study is because it really piqued my interest in terms of how to frame information and then how different people respond to those different information, so on and so forth, is really testable and interesting. And that leads me to this specific research, okay? How information and messengers affect farmers' cover crop adoption, a field experiment. And my graduate student, Baman, was my co-author going forward on this paper. And so what did we do? Well, everybody can see a lot of smiling faces. So this is actually a picture that we took on action when we were actually at the tent in the Canada Outdoor Farm Show earlier. So basically in 2022 in September. And we set up this experiment where farmers actually bet on a variety, actually 4 different types of cover crop seeds. Okay, so let me give you an overview. Okay, so this is a lab in the field experiment, which means we took our iPads out to the field, okay? And that was conducted in September last year. And in total, okay, we have more than 500 farmers who participated, and each of them bet on 4 types of cover crop seeds. So how did we set it up in terms of experimental design? It was computer-based data collection, meaning that we basically automatically stored our data anonymously, okay? And then the participants are actually farmers at that really popular event. In order to actually try to attract different farmers who are actually heterogeneous in terms of their experience, their beliefs, and their previous action, we actually offered a payment of $20 for each of our participants. This is because we don't want to attract farmers who are already familiar or interested in the topic only, okay? And then the mechanism specifically, so through a bidding mechanism, which was against the computer at different randomly drawn price, not other farmers, okay? We offered the opportunity for each farmer to bid on 4 types of cover crop seeds. Those are oats, red clover, fall rye, and supreme soil saver mix. All right. So this is in a nutshell our treatment design table. Okay, you can see that there are 2 dimensions. Okay, so the different rows would give you a sense of what kind of messages people saw as participants. Moving from the last row up, okay, we gave a control where before farmers bid on those cover crop seeds, they did not see any message at all. They just went on the bidding page, which introduced those cover crop seeds and gave a really short description of what the crops are. And then we gave some farmers, okay, a message that appealed for the private benefits of those cover crop seeds. And then in the between subject design, which essentially means farmers either saw this type of message or the other version, which is a public appeal. And in the next slide, I'm actually going to show you what that means, okay? And further, we attributed the identical messages to different messengers, okay? We got sign off from representative messengers that are displayed on this table. And in order not to influence people by saying this is a specific scientist, whose name is this and that, we actually gave farmers generic description. So we just told them scientists said this is the message, okay? And those messengers that we were able to test were scientists, policymakers, nonprofit organizations, fellow farmers, and private company representatives. And again, this was a between subjects design, which means each participant were randomly assigned to either of the boxes, and nobody saw more than one in our experiment. Okay, so what are the messages and what are the interface that farmers saw? So, well, if you look at the public appeal treatment, okay, participants were presented with the following message before they placed their bets on those cover crops. And in quotation, this was what they saw on the iPad screens, okay? So the public appeal reads, did you know cover crops can help the environment? And the randomized messenger in a generic way here have pointed out that cover crops reduce water pollution risks and remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They help the environment and reduce a farm's carbon footprint. Okay, so and then again, each farmer were randomized into one specific treatment group. All right, so then give you a sense on the private appeal, okay? In these treatments, again, the same treatments, the same message were randomized attributed to different messengers. And participants were presented with the following message, again, before they placed their bets on cover crops. So what they saw was, did you know cover crops can improve your soil health? And a randomized messenger here in a generic way have pointed out that cover crops can help farmers improve their soil health and biodiversity. Other benefits include protecting the soil from erosive forces of wind and rain, adding to the soil's organic matter, alleviating soil compaction, and increasing the available nitrogen in the soil. Again, the same message was signed off by representative messengers in this study before we launched it in the field. Okay, so I think some of you might be really curious about how did farmers actually place a bet. So what does it mean that they're bidding against the computer, not other farmers? Okay, the reason why we don't want them to bid against one another is because, first of all, we were not able to actually intake all the bids all at the same time simultaneously. So with our relatively large sample size, which was more than 550 farmers, we were not able to actually conduct a random prize auction simultaneously with all the farmers at the same time. And not to mention that the event actually lasted for 3 days instead of 1. Okay, and then we all know that first prize auctions it's not incentive compatible, and it will cause some kind of competition among farmers. We did not want that to happen. So now, speaking from a behavioral or experimental economics point of view, what we did was a mechanism that people designed in order to actually gauge people's willingness to pay by performing a bidding auction, but then at the same time, they're not bidding against each other. So how did they bid against a computer? Okay, in this mechanism, each participant places a willingness to pay bet on a product. Okay. And then after they place their bet, computer would generate a random experimental market price. Okay, so the experimental market price were drawn from a distribution that represent the real market price of the product at the time, but then the participants were not able to know which price it actually will display, because it was performed through a random draw. And then there's a comparison. So if the market price, the randomly drawn experimental market price, is lower than willingness to pay bet by the farmer, that farmer will get the product at the randomly drawn market price. Okay, so basically, if you bet higher than that randomly drawn price, you will get the product and you get a discount because you pay at the market price, which is lower than your bet. If the randomly drawn market price is higher than the bet, then the participant does not receive the product nor pays for it. Meaning that if the randomly drawn price is higher than your true willingness to pay, it means that, okay, this time you just forego that product because the price is higher than your willingness to pay. There's no reason why you should purchase that product. Okay, we made it super clear to all of our participants. This is the mechanism that we use in order to just let them know that you do not want to overbid, because you may end up buying the seeds at a higher price than your true willingness to pay if you overbid compared to your true willingness to pay. You also do not want to underbid, because if you underbid, you may miss the opportunity to purchase the seeds at a discount. And again, if that's still not clear to the participants, okay, we also added a line there by telling them, all this is saying is you will want to just let us know your true willingness to pay, and you have no incentive to give us a false number in this setting. Okay, well, this is just showing you that in my field of as an economist, there's another language behind describing this mechanism, and it reaches the same conclusion, which means that subjects or participants should always submit the bids that are equal to their true valuations, that there's no reason for them to deviate. And of course, we save those equations to ourselves in our publication. Okay, so then this is the interface that each participant saw when they placed their bet, and this this is one example, okay, which was the public appeal. So basically, we reminded them that did you know cover crops can help the environment? And in this case, this specific product was 1 acre of seeds for oats. And we also gave them a short description of this cover crop, as well as a picture of the seeds and a picture of the plant. And then we asked them, what is the maximum amount of money you're willing to pay for this item? And then if you absolutely do not want to purchase this item at any price, please enter 0. And they have a slider, which they can slide to the left or to the right. And then with an upper bound of $20 in this case, they can also input their bids in the text box if they choose to do so. All right, so now I described to you what the participants did, as well as what did we randomize in terms of treatments, okay? I hope everybody is excited to see what we found, okay? So the next slide shows that. Okay, I think this graph actually tells a really exciting story, and let me allow me to explain that to you, okay? So how to read it? This slide, this graph actually shows you the average bids under private and public information delivered by different messengers. Okay, and then on the y-axis, you can see that we actually gave a full range of the bids. Well, actually, the bids were spent anywhere between 0 and 25, not 20. Okay, so and in this case, what we saw was actually on average, farmers in our experiment bid really reasonably, and those average bids actually represent somewhat the market price for 1 acre of seeds at that time. Okay, and then if you look at each of the bars, okay, the chunk on the right of the screen represent people's average bids when they received information in terms of a private benefit framing, when the message actually were delivered to them by different messengers. And on the right hand of the screen, okay, that chunk you saw is the public information framing, again, delivered by different messengers. So what's really, really exciting here is the following, okay? First of all, I want to remind you that each of the bars is independent from one another because each participant either bid under the private information framing or the public information framing, and they contributed to only one treatment. Okay, so each participant only contributed to one treatment in terms of the framing and messenger. Okay, so if you keep that in mind, okay, and you see how consistent these messengers are, regardless of the framing in terms of their ranking by different bid from farmers, you can see the very clear trend. Okay, you can see the very clear trend. So compared to the black bar here, which is the control, where before farmers place their bids, they receive no message at all about either the public or the private benefits of cover crop seeds. And the average bid was about $21 per acre of seeds. And then you move from that black bar, one bar to your right-hand side, okay? That's when people bid, when we attributed the message to non-profit organizations. And you can see that either we said the private information was attributed to the non-profit organization, or if we actually said non-profit organizations deliver the message from a public information framing point of view, either way, farmers bid higher compared to if they didn't see any message at all. And then again, you can see how consistent it was, no matter if the framing was public or private. Okay, and then if we move further down to the right-hand side on both chunks of the graph, you can see that telling them the messages were from fellow farmers almost didn't change their average bidding at all. And then telling them these are from policymakers, again, didn't give people a very, very good nudge to actually change their bidding behavior, nor did private companies. However, until you see the scientists which are the two bars that are on the far right of each chunk of the graph. And then what's really, really interesting, well, it's kind of disappointing to me as a scientist, but at the same time, it's a very, very clear message where compared to all these other messengers, either telling them scientists give them some public benefits of a description or public benefits, significantly decrease farmers' average bet on cover crop seeds. So again, this is very robust finding because again, I reminded all of you that each farmer only contributed to one of the bars here. So basically, different farmers actually showed us consistently that receiving a message from scientists decreased their willingness to pay for cover crop seeds. Okay, so again, then putting that into somewhat a jargon probably, but then with this table, what I wanted to show you from this preliminary table, we're still doing some work on it, is that we were trying to run the model and see if those different messengers actually caused farmers to be more likely to bid zero, so they shy away from placing any bid on cover crops, or did they actually change people's bid in a continuous way? So I just wanted to highlight the main results here. Okay, so if you look at scientists, it's actually the only messenger that both decreased farmers' likelihood of placing a bid at all, as well as decreased farmers' actual bid when they decided to place a bid. Okay, so if you look at all these other messengers, receiving some kind of information from these messengers actually increased farmers' likelihood of placing a non-zero bid. But then at the same time, when they actually place their bet, they somewhat decrease their bet. So basically, so each of the other messengers actually increased the number of bidders in our game, but then they did not significantly increase their bet when they choose to actually adopt cover crops. Okay, so basically, it increased the rate of adoption or the rate of placing a bet on cover crop seeds, but then didn't really increase the willingness to pay after people decide to adopt. Okay, and then if you look at the last part in this table, what it means is we also collected some demographic information from our farmers, and then we run a regression to see, you know, the reading of this table would be farmers who have organic practices, who use organic practices, are significantly more likely to they have significantly higher willingness to pay for those cover crop seeds, and higher age decreased people's willingness to pay for those seeds. Women were significantly more willing to pay for those seeds, and participants who identify them with a liberal political party are more likely going to pay for those cover crop seeds. Okay, and then so I think that's enough numbers. And then let me again step back a little bit. This is actually my last slide, and I just wanted to show you the conclusion, or in terms of results, what are actionable. Okay, so we found that highlighting private versus public benefits of cover crops did not significantly impact farmers' bidding behavior, but for each messenger, the private appeal performed at least as good as the public appeal. So stepping back here to this graph, this is what we found. Although the differences are really, really minor, you can see that when people received the private information from each of the messengers, their average bet was slightly higher than if they received the public information from the same messenger. Okay, so you're comparing those bars of the same color, and then the ones on the left-hand side outperform the ones on the right-hand side for each of them. Okay, so that's the first actionable item that I wanted to talk about. So if you were going to choose between private and public appeal, okay, so what we've shown is the private appeal performed at least as good as the public appeal. And then the other result that I want to share is identical messages attributed to nonprofit organizations increased farmers' average bid by about 5%, while those attributed to scientists decreased the average bid by about 14%. So those numbers are both compared to the control group, where farmers did not receive any messages at all. And to me, that's really the takeaway from this experiment. It actually highlights the importance of scientists teaming up with nonprofit organizations and communicate our scientific findings in a very careful way. We cannot just assume that any information is going to do us good in terms of increasing the adoption or increasing the willingness to pay among farmers, let alone that we found robust and consistent finding from this specific experiment that if you're not careful in terms of designing your message and your messengers, okay, it can actually decrease farmers' willingness to pay for cover crop seeds, which means it could potentially backfire, okay? And then to that, I will conclude. Would be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
I have a question. And just to say that Heather from Soils at Guelph is listening very carefully. Because those findings mean a lot for Heather's impact and role. So in general, the experimental model and the way that the approach that you take to understanding people's decision making is so interesting to me because of it's just interesting, but it's particularly interesting, and I think the audience will agree, because of a theme that we talked about earlier today, that no one can really say what their social norms are or what their barriers and needs actually are. Like, they can say what they think they are, but I'm not very good at knowing myself. I think it can be like a sweeping generalization that, that we're always getting to know ourselves a little bit better. I'd love to hear a little bit about your future hopes for research, maybe some of the proposals that that you have out there, but kind of what research questions are really exciting you right now.
Yeah, so I think particularly there are two research questions that are really exciting to me, and I think I do have some resources to actually get those examined. One is, so what is the best way to incentivize farmers? So what are actionable and what are the best solution among those actionable items? For example, if we have $1 million to spend, how do we choose how to subsidize farmers? So there are a lot of questions under that, which means, who should we subsidize? Should we focus on the farmers who are already in our social networks and who already got their foot in the door? And then we should focus on them in hopes of, if we change their behavior and move them forward, even so, they can actually go ahead and influence other farmers through their social network? Or should we actually focus more on the people who are not even aware of those best management practices, or who are not getting their foot in the door? So again, it's literally a $1 million question. How do you spend that money? And then another research question that's related is what I'm currently doing, actually. So what would be the best way when you try to incentivize people? So in those subsidies, so the first question was, who should we subsidize? The second one is, how should we subsidize? Should we just have this kind of flat rate where we accept applications and we incentivize people by that predetermined flat rate, or should we allow farmers to tell us how much they would have to be compensated in order to implement some kind of practices? And then if the first, what should be that flat rate? Which one should be the best flat rate that we can determine? If the second one, then how do we actually incentivize farmers in a way that we can have a lot of participation and interest, and farmers are actually going to reveal their truth, so on and so forth. And then how do we design those kind of eligibility criteria? I think all of those, you can see, Tori, that there was a lot of questions, so I got really excited and gave you a really long answer. But
I appreciate it. I want to try and capture like two questions into one. So this will kind of challenge you to hypothesize on the why a lot, but kind of the response to scientists and the seemingly lack of response to fellow farmers. One audience member hypothesizes like that kind of our public relationship with science during COVID may have influenced the response to science, but like why? Why do you think it is that they responded poorly to scientists delivering the information? And why do you think that they didn't respond to fellow farmers? If peer-to-peer information sharing can be so impactful, what's your hypothesis there?
So first of all, this is a joke I always like to tell, like as the experimental economists, we're all evidence-based. We always just take a look at the data without asking the why. But here, I think in this context, I really want to try to answer that question a little bit. So in terms of why they didn't respond to scientists in a positive way, I don't think that's surprising, right? We see that over time, the trust in scientists have been declining, so on and so forth. And I do have some other work also finding that when we told people scientists said recycled water can be really pure and clean, people responded to it negatively compared to all these other messengers. So that's not really surprising to me in terms of, why didn't they respond, in a favorable way to fellow farmers? I think it might have to do with the what kind of information were actually delivered. I think the peer-to-peer, if I'm not wrong, a lot of the things are hands-on. So they're very used to having this kind of peer-to-peer effect from other fellow farmers from a hands-on point of view. And then the messages we actually tested were kind of still scientific messages. And probably they don't really resonate a lot by thinking, oh, other farmers definitely said those kind of stuff. But they didn't respond to it in a negative way either, which is relatively good news. So going forward, we could potentially, change that language a little bit and actually work with fellow farmers a little bit more to see how they normally communicate to others. But then the catch there is, then we can't really test the homogeneous generic message that are also attributed to other messengers. Because I don't see scientists doing those kind of hands-on communication with farmers. So that's the one of the constraints of our study. It's all else equal. You vary one factor at a time. So
Yeah, thank you for that. And next question. I guess on the other side of the coin is that Paul is reflecting that it was interesting that the highest price was attributed to a nonprofit organization as a messenger. Do you think that do you think that a sense of objectivity plays a part in that? Do you think a sense of representation, like organizations serve members and those members are farmers? Like where do you think, where would you place your bet?
I do want to dodge that question because I'm really not sure. No, it's fun to say the words because I almost never dodge any questions. But in this case, what I mean is I think well, there are a lot of folks from non-profit organization in this audience, right? And I think it's actually better for you guys to actually hypothesize on why did that happen. I mean, from my point of view, I just read the data. It's just like so consistent and robust across two different messages. So I'm a believer of that story. In terms of why, I'm actually hoping to get some answer from the experts in this audience.
Yeah, so put your hypotheses in the chat, guys. Why do you think that nonprofit orgs stimulated the highest willingness to pay? Yeah, what do you think happened there? Put it in the chat.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Please.
I'm sorry if I missed this, Tongzhe. Did you give specific names of nonprofits? Or
No.
How exactly was it worded? I can't quite recall.
Yeah, so all of them were worded in a generic way. So we just said, did you know this and that? Scientists have found the following, or nonprofit organizations have stated the following. So basically, we just varied that one messenger's name in a generic way. So it's either scientists or nonprofit organizations or government agencies or fellow farmers or, what's the other one? Private company representatives.
Yeah. Very cool. I think at this point, we might be able to move on to the first time that we'll have enough time to have a facilitated discussion with Paige leading us through it. Unless there's any other questions. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, Tongzhe. Yeah, I'm really excited to support your work in whatever ways that we can. It was a lot of fun. Let me tell you, it was a lot of fun to host that experiment. It brought like a whole bunch of new faces into our tent at the Canada Outdoor Farm Show that would usually have just like walked right on by us. And it was really, yeah, it was, the experience itself was cool and the research is even cooler.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the support. My team is hoping to get back to that event every single year going forward, and each year we'll scratch the surface once at a time.
Yeah, thank you both, Tongzhe and Erin. Both really, really unique studies and lots of interesting results that came out of it. So as Tori had said, we're going to take a bit of time to kind of reflect and digest some of the information that we've learned today. If you guys attended both events, I know it's probably a lot of information to take in. I know I'm still processing stuff, but it's a good opportunity while we have everybody here to kind of reflect on some of the maybe new and exciting bits of information that jumped out to you today or is going to stick with you as you kind of move forward from this event. So if anyone wants to share, unmute yourselves and share with us, are there new things or exciting things that have jumped out to you that you feel like you're going to take with you forward, maybe into your own work or into your own lives? Yeah, Heather, go ahead.
I have more of a curiosity, since this is the Ontario Soil Network sort of event. I'm struck by the morning sessions with the starburst versus the peripheral. Whether or not you see the farmers in the leadership program as being a starburst or as in the periphery.
Yeah, we definitely we see them originally as being in the periphery. You know, we look for, when we're selecting them, if they're really involved in community. We don't necessarily select like a star-studded cast for our cohort every year. And we look for, you know, caring about soil health, but not necessarily being like self-described experts on soil health. So we really try to select people in the periphery. We do like, doubt our methods all the time. It's so hard to like keep up with research and implement it and see if it works, and then kind of continually develop our process. We do encourage when we kind of build our work plan for the year ahead, we encourage people to do what they want to do and what they think will be important for their community. And then kind of on top of that, we do layer some like very firework type activities onto it. Like we take their photos for an ad campaign, and we get them into all of the winter conferences to talk and to reach more people. And so I do question if we're doing that well enough, if we're preparing people with training well enough to be in that position, or if it doesn't matter, since we're kind of layering it on top, but making a backbone of community building or like network density, densification. Yeah.
Thanks. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I was just, I was struck by that. Yeah, because I'm a big fan of the network.
Yeah. It's always uncertain. Well, I always feel uncertain if we're doing the right thing. Oh.
Yeah, along the same lines as what Heather said, I was struck. I mean, I was unfamiliar with Damon's work in the book and that trend, and so I found it, kind of revolutionary in the sense of it's a bit like challenging the whole adoption diffusion model in a way. That classic model that we all learned about, and it's a bit like behavioral economics versus classical economics. It turns a lot of things on their head, and the implications are enormous for building on the periphery. So what that would look like, I guess, is in my mind is the big question. What does that look like when you're building on the periphery rather than these hubs and spokes and so on and so forth? And I mean, to me, it suggests that building strong local networks, local connections with all different kinds of personalities may be the most important part, rather than trying to get a generation of spark plugs, if you like. So anyway, just to throw that out there.
Yeah, thanks so much, Paul. Beth, I see your hand is up as well.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I really have been appreciating the way that today's sessions have kind of complemented what I've been thinking a lot about, and I'm just currently organizing a focus group for a project I'm working on with the Transition Accelerator about payment to producers. So I'm just really focused on carbon markets versus premiums, payments from governments versus from private companies. And this has really been good to remind me about how that's not, I know that that's only one of the ways, or one of the elements that producers need to be able to be willing to make a practice change. I was really interested, Tori, you threw out something in the introduction about how we throw money at producers and then nothing changes. So it's like, oh, I want to hear more about what those examples are that you're thinking of. And the more question part that I've been holding is in this idea of wide bridges, how how long is too long in terms of what the distance between those, whatever they're called, you know, those micro parts of the network, you know, is bridging between Ontario and Quebec, say, too far, or you know, Alberta and Ontario. And just like, I would love to learn more about those bridges and what works and what doesn't in terms of those bridges.
Yeah, I want to chime into that too, because that made me think of like this this like common understanding, or like this idea that I've heard thrown around a lot, that like farmers in a region are not gonna like, they're not gonna trust or like respect the like logic and experiences of people in their own backyard, of people like from within their community. They're like far more likely to be open-minded and open to entertaining the like logic and experiences of like someone from like not their community, where they're like holding themselves all accountable to this like social norm kind of thing. And then, yeah, the theme of like wide bridges there made me really think of like of that theme, because I've seen it in practice, where people are more open when they're maybe not so like acutely feeling those social norms. But Erin, I think this is a question that I'd love you to weigh in on, in terms of like, you know, outsiders, whether it be people from the other side of our own province, or people from another province, or people that just don't share the same kind of community, like how much their identity affects or doesn't affect people's willingness to be open to new ideas. And yeah, what are some of like the indicators that would dictate their success there?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I can't remember what other topic it was that came up recently, and someone said, yeah, there's just so much written about this. There's a lot written about, I missed the talk this morning, so I'm missing some of the context for the question, but I know I've actually looked a lot at social capital. I don't know if Damon was using specifically that term, but there's, in the social capital literature, there's a lot of talk about bonding links, which are those links amongst like actors, and bridging links, which are those links amongst unlike actors. But it's not like a fixed definition of what constitutes a bonding versus a bridging link. And it's very contextual. So, I mean, people from Ontario and Quebec are different. But if you pull the lens back or look at it in a different way, you could say, okay, well, we're looking at people from Canada, and they're different from, so a link could be bonding or bridging amongst the same two people, potentially, depending on the context. If it's something interesting to you, I would recommend looking into that social capital literature. It's really interesting. There's a great paper, like the classic paper that gets cited a lot is called The Strength of Weak Ties, which is all about the power of those bridging linkages that we might think of as not having as much influence, but they really do. Yeah, I mean, I could go on and on about social capital, but I think it might be more useful to go out and maybe read about it. There's a great book too, that like the classic book called Bowling Alone, about the importance of social capital and community, which I think is sort of relevant to this conversation. But yeah, sorry, that as a qualitative researcher, I'm never good at having like clear yes, no answers, like the degree of, or how you would define a bridging link. It's always sort of contextual and complicated. But I think it's an important question to consider and to ask people what they would think of as, I mean, you'd have to find a different way to phrase it, but it might be an interesting research question to ask people who they would consider their same ties versus who they would consider a bridging tie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes me think of the it makes me think of the glass holes, or this like very specific instance that Damon described, where Google was trying to like come up with a product called Google Glass, where you like wear these glasses and you can record stuff and experience social media and life at the same time. But they use these like very like high profile, high lifestyle influencers to try and like disseminate the idea and make it cool, but then turned the idea on itself and just like turned Google Glasses into like something that people had a lot of disgust for. And to me, that's the same side of the coin as social capital. It's like the qualities that we attribute to a person, and then therefore to the idea that we attach to them, and like how like what what is social capital, and like what are some of the factors that go into the weight that we give it when we're considering an idea. It's maybe that's a long roundabout way of asking that question. Oh, I'm asking you, Erin, sorry. But also you're muted.
Thank you. I did some research a few years ago now looking at community food initiatives in Ontario, and we looked across a range of counties. So it's interesting seeing Paul's comment about networking across counties. One of the things we found was that there were lower prevalence of these community food initiatives in some counties. And when we did the research, one of the factors that we ended up focusing on was the idea or the finding that there was a lot of connectivity in the counties where there weren't as many initiatives, but it was more inward-looking connectivity, both geographically and also sectorally. So we found that where there tended to be like a higher prevalence of these community food initiatives was in places where there was more of that cross-county connectivity, but also cross-sectoral connectivity. So not just farmers maybe connecting with other farmers, but farmers connecting with consumers, farmers connecting with nonprofit organizations, perhaps connecting with municipal governments. So thinking about those links can be geographic, but also sectoral.
Yeah, Lisa, I see your hands up.
Welcome, everyone. I'm happy to join this conversation. I'm based in Pennsylvania and the heart of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So our farmers in Pennsylvania have been under a lot of kind of pressure to adopt best management practices for this aspect of improving water quality for almost 30 years now. But I've really enjoyed all of the presentations today. I did miss Julia's this morning, but I got a lot of good kind of reaffirming information, I think, from Damon about some things that we're trying to do here in Pennsylvania with that farmer networking. And it was reaffirming to me that I think we're on the right track. But one thing that we're trying to do with our farms here in Pennsylvania is that regional approach, trying to identify kind of those like-minded farmers within a county or perhaps maybe a 2-county region, and creating just short 2-hour kind of small group meetings really for that peer-to-peer kind of networking opportunity. And what I connected with what Damon shared is about that wide bridges kind of concept, that is really how things shift and change. And recognizing that connection is that these small regional groups also have members of a statewide organization called the Pennsylvania No-Till Alliance. So they are then networking more on a statewide level. And then even some of those key people in the small county groups attend national level conventions, No-Till on the Plains, the National No-Till Conference, that they're getting ideas, networking with people there, and then bringing those ideas back to their local groups. So we're only about 3 years into that process of kind of building these regional groups, but that's definitely one thing that we're trying to do here in Pennsylvania to really kind of shift that needle. We feel like we've done a really good job at reaching those innovative and kind of early adopter type growers. And now we're trying to identify ways to meet those kind of more reluctant middle adopter kind of group of farmers to really start kind of shifting the needles. And we're hoping that these local groups are going to be a way to disseminate and kind of shift that social norm within those local areas to get higher adoption rates. So I just wanted to share with the group that that's what the approach that we're taking in Pennsylvania.
That's very cool. And like, yeah, that's the approach that that we take too. It's just like really informal. It's like reduce the barrier to getting together. You know, if it's a big to-do event, then you're going to have less of them, and you're not going to have the opportunity to develop the relationship, which is the important thing there. And then, but then, yeah, to give them a little bit of either training or structure. We kind of like, we end up doing both sometimes, but sometimes not too. Really depends on the individual. So that, you know, because like it happens, it happens that people will gather to talk soil and then forget about why they gathered, because they're so focused on like building the relationship and like feeling comfortable around each other and feeling like they're not at the coffee shop kind of thing.
And I think that comfort level is key, and that small group we're finding is key, that if you get more than about 20 people, they're not as willing necessarily to share and be open and honest, you know, so the smaller group. And we're finding too, we get better participation when we can find a fellow farmer to host the group, because there's a lot of interest among the local farmers to check out what their neighbor's shop is set up like, or what their equipment is set up like. And so we've found it to be successful finding a farmer to actually host that small group meeting versus, you know, having it at a local restaurant or, you know, a conference room in somebody's building somewhere. So
yeah, big time. And it's yeah, more people come and then more people stay longer. Like we just had an event where people stayed until 1 in the morning to talk of. There's very few things that I would want to talk about until 1 in the morning. A question from Paul in the chat for Tongzhe. Will your research bring out any difference in preferences between early, middle, and late adopters? That's a cool question.
Yeah, so I was just trying to type in, but if I can just like unmute myself. So yes is the short answer. And in different research projects, we actually try to address that question in different ways. For example, in the one that I just presented, we asked people whether or not they've adopted cover crops before, so on and so forth. And so basically in this case, we can take a look, we can stratify our data or sample and take different people's preferences, so on and so forth. We don't know if we'll have sufficient statistical power because for now, we don't know how many people would fall under each of the categories. So we'll take a deeper look at the data. But for some of the other like randomized controlled trials, like true field work, we definitely ask that question and see how people respond to different incentives and subsidies differently when they when they've adopted such a practice before, or if they're returning to that practice, or if they're expanding that practice, so on and so forth. Yes, so basically we do address that question, but it's rather complicated to actually put it in a very, very general term. It's just like it's research specific.
Yeah. Yeah. So much of the content and programming that I see in Ontario is really, really focused in on those like middle adopters, like people who haven't done a lot, but are open to it, willing to try, kind of thing. And it's, you know, just like with everything else that we've been learning today, seems like the right thing to do. But yeah, I am really curious about kind of the return on investment for environmental programs that you'll find in that reverse auction kind of method. And then, yeah, parting it out between like different target groups is an even greater layer.
So Terry, since you're talking about that, I just wanted to quickly share. So we do have the bids coming in from our so this is actually our second intake. The first one was a pilot, but it seems to me that if you only care about how many acres you can reach within with a certain amount of dollar, targeting the new adopters would not be the way to go, right? Because they tend to be higher. So basically they're requiring higher compensation from the program in order to get the practices adopted. But then at the same time, if you think about this in a social network, is it the acreage the only variable that you want to take a look at? Is really the question. So we do have the data, and it shows strongly that people who've never adopted that practice before, but way higher and require way higher compensation compared to the people who are either expanding their acreage or they're returning to that practice. So they stopped using it in the previous year. So I think those are really, really interesting questions. But again, I don't think there is a universal answer to that. And another like quick point that I want to make is, if you think about, so who are actually the late adopters, right? For example, I just got my farm last year, and I didn't have a lot of experience farming myself. So I'm trying to explore, but then there's so many other farmers that I knew, they're not even aware of this kind of programs or even practices. So those are the people that are not in our data sets. And so how do we specify, how do we define late adopters? Are those people who got completely left out due to a variety of reasons? And how do we reach out to them? Is it worth reaching out to them, from an economic perspective? So all of those questions are really burning, and I'd be more than happy to help address them going forward.
Mm-hmm. Heather, I saw your hand up. You didn't want to.
I did have my hand up, but then I realized I've spoken before, and there's others on the call that maybe are just waiting to be pushed to raise their hand. So I'll stay quiet for a bit more.
Okay. Yeah. I'd love to, just as like an exercise to like get maybe some of the quieter members of our group comfy with speaking up. I'd love to kind of hear about who is working with farmer networks. And like who is working on, some kind of innovation adoption, but not necessarily, and hasn't necessarily included social networks into what they do as of yet. And I'm gonna, if it's okay, you can just turn your camera off if you really don't want to say anything. But Scott Hortop, I hope I pronounced your name right. But I'd love to know kind of what you do, and maybe what your kind of like lasting burning question from today is.
I'm glad you've asked, Tori. I actually was going to ask a question, but thanks for the encouragement. I'm involved with an organization called Climate Network Lanark, and I produce fungal dominant compost. And I'm not a farmer, but I have been involved. We in our Climate Network Lanark have been wanting to contribute as we could to promoting the adoption of cover crops, and so listening in on this thing has been really helpful. It's been interesting to read between the lines what you did to form the Ontario Soil Network. It seems that it was highly managed in terms of the way that network was formed, compared to, if we do to each of the EFAO chapters or OSCIA chapters, they're local, and they sort of follow a format, and they're somewhat random the way people come together. But if you've been successful, which I think you have with OSN, forming a network that really sort of sings in terms of its effectiveness as a network, I wonder if there's some lessons learned from that leadership of EFAO and OSCIA might take, and if maybe looking inwards, OSN could actually do a little module that shares lessons with individual chapters on how they could be a more high performance network for the sake of themselves, their own membership.
Yeah, certainly. And I think like that's like our secret objective today, is to be like, gift all of our failures and learnings to the world, so that we can all.
Yeah, you're actually doing that, aren't you? Except we don't have don't have a big attendance. Yeah. Yeah.
But we are recording, so people will have access to it. Yeah. We have learned so many things at the Soil Network, sometimes the hard way. And sometimes, you know, in not hard ways. I think like some of the one biggest change that we did was to like scrap the idea of the leadership challenge and transform it into the network challenge. That's like really that's really allowed us to like focus our intended impact and communicate our intended impact. Once we did that kind of and started asking the question, like, what does it mean to be a network builder or community builder, things got a lot easier to plug and play from from other sectors, from like community organizing and like amongst social workers and amongst like activist groups. Like they've been working on community organizing and building community and doing stuff with community for a really long time. So it was really easy to take a lot of those themes and plug it in. But also like framing our challenge as a network challenge, like allowed us to ask like what might be some of like the deep root causes that are causing communities to feel fractured and are causing people to treat each other poorly, at the coffee shop. And so a lot of those, like thinking about that has really changed the way that we train people, because we like train them, but we really just like bring them on board to like a set of commitments to like to active involvement and non-judgment, and like valuing diversity of our network. So we train people in, like, you know, all the classic things like how to communicate, how to tell your story, how to do research, kind of pretty generic, like leadershipy stuff. But we also train them in like nonviolent communication and how to navigate conflict and like how to weather those countervailing influences, and how to facilitate discussions.
Yeah.
Kind of
Oh,
thing.
that's golden. And Lions clubs and EFAO groups don't get any of that reflection and assistance in making the process work. And it wouldn't, just a little bit of those inputs would go a long way, I think, in a there's so much take it for granted that we know how to be a network, and there isn't a consensus on that. There isn't a deep social knowledge about that. That's
Tori, if I might make a comment right here at the end, I'm back on the network again. I've been on and off in the snowstorm. I've been on this soil health journey for 45 years, full package for the last 22. And my farm is very visible. The county road travels along two sides of it, and people can see, and apparently some do come to look, although I'm somewhat isolated out here on the end of the point. But my main concern, and I know I've expressed it to you before, is that I don't seem to be getting the uptake from neighbors. I don't have any close neighbors, but nothing within 20 miles. But there just doesn't seem to be, and I don't understand why. And I've made a couple of presentations and I've taken a couple of opportunities, but and people can see what I've been doing. You know, they're watching that crazy bastard out on the point to see what he's up to now. And you know, we've been doing everything that Erin mentioned in her on the part of her presentation that I saw, and I don't know how to get over that barrier. That's my main concern, and everybody's talked about it in various ways, but that just baffles me. Thank you.
Yeah. No problem. Yeah, I think and I'd love to hear from everyone else on, like, you know, how Eric is putting a lot on his shoulders, right? He is one farmer looking to change the world, and and let's all be like Eric for a moment, and like, so when you look at your impact, what do you look for usually? And given today's learnings, how might you change how you think about?
The thing that bothers me most is I continue to see, for starters, tillage all around me. Well, around me, there's nobody close to me, but anyway, and the lack of use of cover crops. Those are our two simple steps. We went straight in 22 years ago from our learning experience for the 20 years before that to no-till, crop rotation. We did some of these things beforehand too, of course, and cover crops, mixed cover crops. Tile drainage has always been a big deal for us. We've been tile draining since we got here 53 years ago. But and like I said, we're very visible. There are no fences, there are no obstacles, there are no fence lines. There's nothing to be able to not see what we're doing. And yet, and like I said, I've made a couple of presentations locally, and people obviously know what we're doing, but I just don't see the uptake in. And it surprises me because some of these are people whom I don't know well. I'm not a dairy farmer, but there just isn't the uptake, and I don't understand why. And we're on some very difficult soils, silty clay, and believe me, if you can no-till that, you can no-till anything. And we've been doing that for 20 odd years. Um,
Eric, I'm
yeah,
gonna
that's my main concern, and I don't know how to approach it. And I'm getting too old to worry about it anymore, but it still bothers me.
I'm gonna cut you off there, Eric, because I think that Heather either has a question or might have an answer for you. I don't know.
Yeah, Eric, this was one of the things that I was going to say earlier too, and I resonate with what you're saying in the sense that there's times when you hear, Lisa saying she's been doing this in the Chesapeake Bay, I said it wrong, area for 30 years, and I was working with it 20 years ago and then left and came back and was like, what has changed? It is quite possible to get discouraged, and I hear that in your voice, Eric. But that's what I reflected on from, I think Anne said something about it being patient, and then with the story of the Black Lives Matter, there's 400 years of discouraging behavior. And then in the anecdotal story today, the speaker spoke about, the difference that a 6-year time period made, and that was powerful. And then I'm also going to draw from, I guess he's an Indigenous folk singer called Willie Dunn, and he was very active for years and years and years, speaking up about the things that now are getting attention, long after he's been dead, about residential schools and all of that sort of thing. And I heard an interview about him and listened to some of his music, and one of his pieces of advice for the youth that he was working with was just to stay ready, because you never know when that moment will come, and then all of the infrastructure that you've been sort of frustrated at, chipping away at for years, will all of a sudden set into the motion. And so not to give up hope. Just keep moving, I guess, is that's kind of what came to me today. Sorry, I didn't mean to make it a pep talk.
Yeah, don't give up hope. Pep talks are important. I think especially when working with complex change that has real countervailing influences, there's there's good arguments out there for not caring about soil health, or fair arguments at least, and a lot of them, and so it is quite the task to to remain hopeful among countervailing influences. I love that word today. I don't know what else to call it because my brain is half dead now, but yeah, there's countering them and letting an idea spread, and then there's also kind of like safeguarding yourself and safeguarding your hope despite being surrounded by it. And I think one thing that I see with the Soil Network all the time is people see what we've been doing. They're like, "You're doing great. We love this. How do you scale?" And we are scaling. It's just that our involvement is a pinch of salt, in what is otherwise largely out of our control, and something that we can certainly monitor through incredible research partnerships like the ones that we have with Dr. Erin Nelson and Dr. Julia Baird. But they're largely out of our control. They're happening, but we're not going to be able to see it in the room in that moment, because then we know that it was a firework mode of reaching out to people, and then it would fizzle out as soon as it was done. As soon as the event's over, then the impact's over. And so it's arguably, it is harder to see, and it requires research partnerships to be able to see and appreciate and track. Unless you're working with there's all sorts of social listening.
And I realize I realize I'm not alone in spite of your comment, but I looked within the last year and put together a list of 20 organizations in Ontario who are promoting the whole concepts, ideas, and I originally thought a few years ago that the soil network would be instantly successful, and Heather, obviously it hasn't been. Not that it's not successful, but it's not as successful as I thought it would be or could be. But that doesn't mean I have any intention of changing practices. I'm always looking, I'm always reading, studying, trying to find out what else I can do. But anyway, thanks for the opportunity.
No problem, Eric. Josephine, can I pick on you to tell us who you are, what do you do? And one burning question that you have left for today.
Hi, everyone. I've enjoyed those sessions a lot. So I'm a researcher, originally trained in economics, and then throughout my PhD, I added on ecology, and I found agriculture to be like the sweet spot where a lot of this training is useful. And so currently I'm doing a postdoc at the University of British Columbia with a sociologist and an ecologist, and we're actually starting a project in Southern Ontario around trying to think about converting low profit land at a within field scale into semi-natural habitat for wildlife, with pollinators in mind a lot, but it's not the only, I mean, there are many possibilities. And so it's along the lines of programs like the Conservation Reserve Program in the US, like what ALIS Canada does on a Canadian side. I think CIA has a few species at risk programs that do a little bit of that. And so it's, there's a few components to that research project, and we're starting with qualitative research, actually in line with what Erin was presenting this morning, trying to just understand farmer decision making at the subfield level, whether there is an opportunity in the first place with those decisions, whether thinking about on-farm habitat on low profit land is actually an interesting thing to think about, because it's, I mean, of course it's attractive on paper, but then again, like in terms of actually thinking about implementing a practice, as someone was mentioning, I'm not the one taking the risk, so I need to understand a lot better sort of what the actual process entails. And so I'm not sure where I'm going with this, because I'm not going to give you the whole research pitch. But anyway, I think the work that I'm starting to get in is really in line with a lot of what we've been talking about today. And so I've been reflecting a little bit, and I'm about to start the interviews. And so thinking about trying to understand every farmer's context, including the network and the social norm aspect. I feel like it's a big piece, and I can't try to like just plug it in and hope to discover everything. So I'm trying to understand right now if this is something that I can delve into, or if I should just not try to do too much at once. I think that's where I'm at in my thought process right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of power and potential for impact and not doing too much at once.